Chapter 11. Nick had no idea where to start. Everything had been prepared and now they only needed a specter, but where could they even get a specter from? The big Zephyx manufacturers had several people searching for specters at any given time while Nick was basically alone. Sure, there was also Winter, but it wasn't his job to find and capture specters. Should I search for a specter with minions? I mean, I know about the blood mosquito and the parasite, but both of them are too powerful. Wait, do weak specters even have minions, or does that require a lot more power? Nick just scratched the back of his head as he stood in front of the warehouse. There are 3 kinds of specters, and I can't even attempt to get any force specters. That only leaves possession specters and physical specters. I really doubt that I would easily find a possession specter since the Zephyx manufacturers love those. At least, that was what Winter said. That means I have to find a physical specter. But where? Nick scratched the side of his head. I mean, I heard the outside is basically filled with specters, but everybody knows that the outside is extremely dangerous. Level 2 specters are already able to damage the walls of the containment unit. While I can't even make a dent in them, obviously level 3 specters would be even more powerful. I don't think going outside of the city would be a smart idea. Nick sighed. Guess that means I'm stuck searching for a physical specter inside the city. Nick still scratched the side of his head. The next moment, he turned towards the direction of the dregs. Maybe I should just start asking around? After a couple of seconds, Nick just shrugged and walked towards the dregs. Sure, why not? Winter looked through one of the windows at Nick, who was walking away. I hope he finds one, Winter thought with furrowed brows, and I also hope the one he finds isn't too strong. After a while, Nick's surroundings became dirtier and dirtier, making him feel like he had come back home. The outer city had been a bit too clean for Nick. It almost felt unnatural. Eventually, Nick reached the marketplace where he had sat for months with his sign. Today was not tax day, which meant that the marketplace was quite normal. People were talking with each other but still keeping a safe distance. After all, everyone could potentially be dangerous in the dregs. Nick scratched the side of his head again. Eventually, someone just so happened to meet Nick's eyes, and Nick walked towards them. The person Nick was walking to was a thin adult man who seemed like he regretted accidentally meeting Nick's eyes right now. Hey, Nick said with a friendly tone, I'm searching for a specter. Near the beginning, the man seemed annoyed and uninterested, but when he heard the word specter, he became nervous. A specter? Which one? He asked with worry. I don't really know. Nick said with uncertainty. This confused the man. What? But you just said you were searching for one. I mean, yeah, Nick answered with an awkward laugh. You see, I am a new Zephyx extractor, and I'm searching for my first specter, you know? When the man heard that, he calmed down a bit, but then he became angry. Then stop talking like you lost a specter. I thought I was in danger or something, he shouted. Yes, sorry and stuff, Nick said as he tried to sound nice. So, you got any hints? No, the man answered with annoyance, and even if I had any, why would I give them to you? I would just tell the investigators. At least they would give me enough money for the next couple of payments. Nick could only sigh. The investigators were people who worked for Zephyx manufacturers, and their job was to find clues about specters. Naturally, a couple of Zephyx manufacturers had already opened some kind of service point where the residents of the city could give them clues regarding specters. And Nick? What did Nick have to offer? Literally nothing. Thanks anyway, Nick said with a sigh. The man snorted when he heard Nick. Apparently, he was still a bit angry about the scare Nick had given him. Nick left the man behind and went to a clerk from one of the stalls. That clerk basically said the same thing. He was annoyed that Nick was wasting his time with useless talk and told Nick that he would just go to the investigators if he had some clues. After asking a couple more people, Nick realized that there was really basically nothing he could gain from talking to the people. They would all just contact the investigators because of the money. Sure, Nick could probably ask Winter for some money to pay the people, but how many people would actually trust Nick's words, and more importantly, how many of the clues would actually lead to specters? After over 2 hours of asking around, Nick still hadn't found a clue regarding a specter. Eventually, Nick just decided to patrol. The people were of no help anyway. Nick walked through several small and remote alleyways, and the floor became more and more unstable. The dregs were way too big for the number of people that lived here. The issue was the amount of money in circulation and the available food. Theoretically, if 2 people lived in one house, just this part of the dregs could hold over 10,000 people, yet there were barely 2,000. Because of that, there were plenty of abandoned places in the dregs. Usually, there was no point in going there. Everything worthwhile had already been looted and stolen while specters hunted humans, which meant that they were also more likely to be amongst humans, and the abandoned dregs basically didn't have any humans yet. Nick was already out of options, and this was the best thing he could do right now. Maybe a specter had its nest and hiding place in the abandoned parts and only went amongst humans when they were hungry? Hey! When Nick heard that voice, his brows furrowed. "What do you want?" Nick asked in annoyance as he looked at one of the broken plates of rusty metal. A moment later, the small head of a rat poked out of a hole in the plate. "I heard you were searching for a weak specter," the rat said with a grin. "I am," Nick said naturally. Nick knew exactly who he was talking to right now, the parasite, the specter that tried to convince him to kill himself. "I know of a couple," the rat said with a chuckle. "Interested?" Nick raised one of his eyebrows. "I am," he said after some hesitation. "All right," the rat said with a grin. "I want 5 bodies. Bring me 5 bodies that have not been killed by Nurse Alice, and I will tell you where you can find a fitting one." Chapter 12. Nick scratched his chin for a bit. The rat looked with interest at Nick. "Not interested," Nick said after a bit. "Oh, come on," the rat shouted, but it still didn't dare to leave its little hole. "It's just 5 bodies. You don't even need to kill them yourself." "No, killing is forbidden," Nick answered. "So?" the rat asked. "Who cares?" "I do," Nick said. "I am a real Zephyx extractor now. I can't do such shady stuff." The rat blinked very slowly. "What?" it asked in a disbelieving and deadpan voice. "Extractors kill the most people. They can basically kill whoever they want. They just need to pay a fine for it." Nick scratched the back of his head. "I mean, I get it, but I don't like it. It feels dirty." The rat looked like it couldn't believe what Nick was saying. "What are you talking about? I literally saw you kill that guy from the insurance gang and dump his body in the ruins," the rat shouted. "Ruins?" Nick asked. "The sewers. The stuff below the grates you're walking on," the rat shouted with annoyance. "Oh, that," Nick said. "Yeah, I killed him. But that was because he was trying to collect information on me. It was self-defense." "Self-defense?" "The guy was just looking at your house. You punched his face in before he could even do anything." "Yeah, like I said, self-defense," Nick answered with annoyance. "He went against me and I answered in kind." The rat scratched on the grate below it with annoyance. "Okay, fine. It was self-defense. Then go out and make some enemies and self-defend yourself into 5 corpses." "No," Nick answered silence. "Why?" the rat asked. "I don't want to kill people that haven't done anything to me. I have morals, you know?" Nick shouted with a serious tone. "Morals?" the rat repeated with annoyance. "Yes, morals," Nick answered. "Okay," the rat said. "Then go purchase 5 corpses or something. Your employer looks like he has money." "Can't," Nick answered. "We are not allowed to keep the corpses. Also, I heard that the entire city is basically looking for you, and if anyone found out that I purchased some corpses to hand them to you, the city would probably kill me." The rat took a deep breath. Okay, it said. "Anyway, my offer still stands. If you are ever interested in some information, just give me some corpses. I don't care where they come from. As long as they are human and have not been killed by Nurse Alice, I am fine with any. Anyway, good luck finding a specter without me," the rat said with a snort before it vanished back into its hole. When Nick heard that, he furrowed his brows again and scratched the back of his head. He really didn't like his current situation. Just now, the parasite had given him a chance to find a specter, but he had declined in the end. Nick could only sigh and accept his circumstances, of course, as someone who had lived in the dregs for his entire life. Nick was a very practical person. Naturally, he had considered the parasite's offer seriously, however. No matter how he reasoned with himself, Nick just couldn't accept helping the parasite. The parasite was a specter that killed a great number of humans. Essentially, it was preying on the weak. Over the years, Nick had looked at the huge pyramid that symbolized the inner city countless times, and whenever he saw the difference between it and the dregs, he felt very similar just based on how the tax system worked. Nick could tell that the rich Zephyx manufacturers in the inner city were preying on the weak and poor people of the dregs. This created a certain hatred for people who preyed on weaker ones. If everyone could just give a little of their belongings, there wouldn't be so many dying people in the dregs. Naturally, Nick knew that this was a very the ideology. Something like this would never happen, yet even if the ideology was it was still what Nick wished for. Nick couldn't change the world, but he could live his own life after his own standards at least, and Nick wouldn't take advantage of the weak people. Taking advantage of the ones in power, like the gangs, sure, but not of the weak ones. Would it be easier to just accept how the world was and go with the flow? Of course. But I don't need things to be easy, Nick thought. I'm strong enough to have morals. Nevertheless, Nick threw one last glance at the hole where the rat had just been. He felt a bit of regret. Someone with Nick's knowledge and strength could probably find 5 corpses without being found. But in the end, Nick just couldn't do it, so Nick just continued walking through the alleyways eventually. The metal below Nick's feet became so unstable that he had to stop. By now, Nick was pretty close to the huge wall around the city. Rows upon rows of silver cameras lined the top of the walls, and they were looking in and out of the city naturally. Several cameras were also pointing at Nick at the moment, however. That wasn't anything unusual. After a bit, Nick just turned around and left this part of the dregs again. Nick looked for a different abandoned part and continued his search there. Hours passed. Still nothing. Nick returned home, ate something, and went to bed. The next day, he continued searching. Nothing. The next day, he went and talked to different people all day. Nobody had anything of value to say. Nick also met an investigator that day who only laughed at Nick. The investigators had already found out that Nick was searching for specters, and apparently, Nick had become a joke within their ranks. They found it quite hilarious that some unknown guy from the dregs was searching for specters while he was up against several huge companies with hundreds of employees. Nick didn't talk to the investigator. Another day passed. Another day passed. Another day passed. Nothing. Nick found absolutely nothing. Yet, Nick didn't give up. He still continued searching. There had to be something, somewhere. If Nick didn't find something, his future would become gray and empty again. Nick wanted to make something of his life, and for that to happen, he needed to find something. He wouldn't give up, no matter how long it took. Chapter 13. Nick kept going to the marketplace and asking people for several days. By now, many people were already telling him that they knew nothing before he could even ask his questions. Constantly getting rejected by everyone didn't feel great, but Nick knew that he had to keep at it. There had to be some weak specters somewhere in the city. Of course, the inspectors also kept ridiculing Nick, yet Nick never truly reacted to the ridicule. He just kept on asking around and searching. 10 days after Nick had started searching, some small things started to change. The people had assumed a more neutral stance instead of directly telling Nick to go away. On top of that, the inspectors actually stopped making fun of Nick. The reason for that was that the inspectors were actually a bit impressed by Nick's grit. Not many people could continue doing something after getting shut down by literally everyone around them. Another 2 days later, one of the inspectors actually stopped in front of Nick. It was a middle-aged man with black hair and a goatee. His build could be described as athletic. He wasn't thin, but he also wasn't fat. Nick, right? The inspector asked. Nick just furrowed his brows and walked past the inspector. Hey, wait a minute. I'm not here to ridicule you, the inspector shouted. Nick turned around and looked at the inspector with a raised eyebrow. I've heard from my people that you have been searching for a specter for about 2 weeks, the inspector said. They are talking quite a lot about you. Near the beginning, it was mostly jokes and ridicule, but by now, quite a few of them actually admire your tenacity. Nick just nodded. Thanks. Is there anything else? The eyebrows of the inspector rose, but the next second, he just chuckled a bit in amusement. So curt and off-putting. Well, you are from the dregs after all. Nick didn't like the condescending tone of the inspector and just turned around to walk away. The inspector just chuckled a bit. Want a job? Nick stopped walking, and his brows furrowed as he turned back to look at the inspector. A job? Yes, as an inspector, the inspector said. Even though you don't know the nuances of finding clues of specters, your tenacity and grit are commendable. Teaching someone how to do something isn't difficult. Teaching them how to gain tenacity and grit is. I'm offering you a position as an inspector in my team. The man said, interested. Naturally, Nick was interested. Sure, he had already signed a contract with Winter Melfian, but his relationship with Winter was strictly business. I already have an attuned Zephyx synchronizer. Is there a way for me to become a Zephyx extractor in the future? Nick asked. The inspector's eyes rose, and he looked at Nick again. Only now did the inspector take conscious note of Nick's formidable muscles. He had heard that Nick was a new Zephyx extractor, but after looking more closely at the business Nick was in, the inspector could just shake his head. There were only 2 people in there, and one of them was Nick. They didn't even have a specter in essence. Nick wasn't even an official Zephyx extractor at this point. After all, he hadn't extracted even 1 unit of Zephyx. There were several people in the dregs with attuned Zephyx synchronizers. There were not many, but there were definitely over 10. It wasn't unusual for someone to come into contact with a specter, yet none of these people could become actual Zephyx extractors. It took way more than just that, so the inspector hadn't considered Nick special, but after meeting Nick face to face, the inspector realized that Nick actually didn't seem weak. He had tenacity, a strong body, guts, and willpower. He could actually become a Zephyx extractor. Sadly, the inspector could only sigh. While it happens occasionally, inspectors don't often become extractors, and the few ones that do don't have attuned synchronizers. I can't make the decision on that, but based on my personal experience, I would say the chances are very low. Sorry. Nick furrowed his brows and looked at the ground. Even though Nick had just essentially heard that he wouldn't become a Zephyx extractor, he was still a bit tempted to accept the offer. What was Nick's goal in life? Right now, Nick only wanted to have a nice future. He didn't want to worry about money. He didn't want to constantly be on guard because somebody might break into his house to kill him. Nick just wanted an easier and more colorful life. Nick knew that an inspector didn't come close to an extractor in terms of payment and status, but it was a solid job. At least, that was something that no one living in the dregs could claim to have. While the lowest-ranking inspectors didn't live in the inner city, they definitely could live in the actual outer city. Normal houses, normal food, normal work. It was already a major step up from living in the dregs, and yet, I'm sorry, Nick said with a sigh, I can't accept. Can you tell me why? The inspector asked. I don't exactly know why, Nick answered. I only know that I want to give life my best shot. I actually want to see if I can capture a specter and become a real Zephyx extractor. If I don't try, I will forever regret it. And if I fail, I can still accept, right? It's not like this is only a one-time offer, Nick explained. The inspector sighed. No, it isn't. Naturally, if you want the position, just tell any of the local inspectors. Nick nodded. Then, thank you for the offer and for understanding. I'm genuinely sorry that I can't accept at this moment. The inspector nodded. No problem, he said. Then, have a good one, Nick said as he turned around to walk away. As the inspector watched Nick turn around, he seemed to struggle with something. It was like an inner conflict was currently taking place in the inspector's mind. For a while, the inspector just looked at Nick. When he saw Nick walk up to a person he had already asked twice in the last 10 days, the inspector sighed again. Nick. Come over here, he said, waving Nick over. Nick stopped and looked back at the inspector. After a bit, Nick turned around and walked up to the inspector. Yes, he asked. The inspector scratched the side of his head with a bitter smile. How important is this to you? The inspector asked. Nick furrowed his brows. Pretty important, it's my life, you know? How good are you in dark places? The inspector asked. Nick looked to the side. The nightmare, one of the 5 level 9 specters, was omnipresent, and whenever anyone entered a dark place, the nightmare would start to poison their minds with doubt, hatred, anger, and all manners of negative emotions. Everyone avoided the dark. It's difficult to resist, Nick answered. Can you survive for an hour without any major trauma? The inspector asked. Nick furrowed his brows again. He didn't answer. For a while, not sure. The inspector looked at Nick with concern for a couple of seconds, but then he sighed. I know where you can find a specter. And it shouldn't be that powerful. Chapter 14. Nick and the inspector walked to the side into an abandoned alleyway. Nick was highly interested in what the inspector had to say. After nearly 2 weeks, Nick had finally found a clue. When they arrived in the alleyway, Nick just nodded at the inspector. The inspector looked around. I'm not supposed to tell you about this, the inspector said. Information regarding specters is top secret. Why are you telling me? Nick asked. Well, there are a couple of reasons. First, I feel like I should help you a bit. I kind of feel bad for you when I see you try this desperately to find a specter. 2, the specter isn't being hunted by the manufacturers anyway. This means that nobody would really miss it. And third, I don't fully agree with my employer's goal, the inspector explained. Their goal? Nick asked. The inspector nodded. There are many specters that we know about but don't capture. There are multiple reasons for that. Sometimes it's incredibly difficult to find the actual location of the specters. The parasite is a good example. The entire city is after the parasite, but nobody managed to track it down. Another reason is that some of the specters are incredibly difficult to contain, and it's even more difficult to keep them contained. While there are containment units that can keep some force specters contained, there are still some of them that can't be contained. For example, outside the city is a specter we call the Swallowing Swamp. It's just a huge swamp that's several kilometers wide. In order to contain that, we would need to commit monumental amounts of resources to it, which wouldn't be worth it. Some specters are also just too powerful. Nurse Alice is a great example. And then there are specters that are living in places that are too difficult to get to. The one I'm going to tell you about is part of that category. Nick became quite interested. Where is it? The inspector pointed at the floor, or more specifically, at the darkness beyond the metal grates everyone was walking on, the sewers, the inspector said. Nick also looked at the ground, since the floor was essentially made of metallic grates. Everyone could see and smell the sewers. In a way, the sewers didn't really look like sewers. In truth, just a couple of meters below the grates, there was just a sea of horrible and dirty water. If anyone broke a grate and fell through, they would fall for about 10 meters and then plummet into a deep pile of water filled with piss, shit, waste, garbage, and so on. There were cases where some of the victims were rescued, but most of them died quickly. In general, the people started to puke violently, which often made them accidentally swallow more of the water. This increased their panic, and they started to rapidly splash around. Oftentimes, they hit some kind of old and rusty nail, which then cut them open. Additionally, the parasites, minions, the rats, often piled onto the victim. Falling into the sewers was a terrifying death. Even more, not all of the floor was made of grates. There were also plenty of places with plates instead of grates. If one had exceptionally bad luck, one might fall into a dark part of the sewers. At that point, the nightmare's influence also attacked them. In the sewers? Nick asked. The inspector nodded. Nick's heart rate increased, and he had to take a deep breath. Where is it exactly? Nick asked. Are you really willing to jump into the sewers? The inspector asked with concern. Nick took another deep breath. Nick imagined himself standing in front of a hole, looking at the murky and dark liquid below. Just the stench would make a normal person retch. Jumping into that, the mental image was horrifying. To be honest, Nick hesitated a while. It wasn't easy to jump into something like that. The only good thing was that nobody would be seeing Nick down there, which would allow him to keep his unique ability active. This meant that drowning or getting pricked by a sharp piece of metal was no real concern. Nick's body became 5 times as powerful when no one was looking. That also meant that the durability of his skin and muscles increased. As long as he didn't ram into a metallic spike jutting out of a solid wall with all his force, Nick wouldn't get wounded. The rats also weren't that big of a problem. Yes, the parasite had a lot of rats, but every rat was valuable. The rats would be able to overwhelm Nick, but Nick would take many of them with him. Nick was quite sure that it wouldn't be worth the trade, so while the sewers were incredibly disgusting and horrifying, they were not actually a danger to Nick. However, 2 other things would still prove to be very dangerous. 1, the specter itself, whatever it was. No specter was weak, and Nick needed to overwhelm the specter, catch it, and bring it back to the surface. 2, the darkness. The sewers were dimly lit at best, and there were also many places that were completely dark. The darker the place, the greater the nightmare's influence. The nightmare's powers affected every single human in the world. It didn't matter how strong someone was. Whether they were a normal person or one of the most powerful extractors in the world, all of them were affected by the nightmare equally. Power didn't matter. Only mental fortitude mattered. Nick would need to resist the nightmare's influence for a prolonged period of time while also actively searching for the specter. Nick only looked to the side. He said that the specter should be on my level, which means it's a level 1 specter. For a level 1 specter, someone has to jump into the sewers and resist the nightmare's influence. I can imagine that it wouldn't be worth the effort. Nick remained silent for several seconds. You know, the inspector said. Nick looked back. Maybe I misrepresented my reasons for helping you a bit. The inspector added. The reasons I mentioned earlier still hold true, but the order might not be the most accurate. The thing I'm actually most concerned about is the last reason. Nick only looked at the inspector. When we find such a specter, the inspector explained, my employer makes a risk assessment. Is it worth to go after it? What are the dangers? What is the potential profit? Since this is only a level 1 specter, it obviously isn't worth it. Because of that, we are just going to ignore the specter. That is until it becomes a level 3 specter. Nick narrowed his eyes. You're saying that they want the specter to feed on the population of the dregs until it becomes a level 3 specter? Nick asked. The inspector looked to the side. Well, my employer is a business, and all businesses are made for profit. When there is no profit to be gained, we don't get involved. My employer isn't letting the specter live just so that it can become more powerful. My employer just doesn't get involved since it's not worth it. My employer is not responsible for keeping the city safe. It's a business, not a charity. It's not my employer's job to protect the people. Nick's demeanor didn't improve. And if your employer told the city about the specter? The inspector didn't immediately answer. The city might do something about it, the inspector added, but they would need to pay quite a hefty sum in return. Also, maybe one day the specter might become profitable enough to catch. Nick didn't need to hear more. Naturally, the inspector wasn't allowed to speak ill of his employer, which was why he was wording it this vaguely, but Nick basically got the gist. The inspector's employer was willing to feed people to the specter until it grew more powerful, and the inspector didn't like that, which was why he was telling Nick about it. Earlier, Nick had still been on the fence, but now, not anymore. I'm doing it, Nick said. The inspector looked into Nick's eyes for a while. The inspector saw that they were filled with a bit of fear but also a lot of conviction. The inspector took a deep breath. It's called The Dreamer. Chapter 15. Nick and Winter stood in front of a destroyed street. The inspector had told Nick everything he knew about the Dreamer already, and Nick had also informed Winter. As always, the sun was in the middle of the sky, and yet the sea of toxic waste still seemed dark. This part of the dregs was abandoned and the road had broken into many pieces, creating a sort of ramp towards the sewers. Nick chose this spot since he also needed a place from where he could return. At this moment, Winter was holding his nose with a white handkerchief, and he looked with disgust and concern at the dirty and grimy water. The two of them looked at the disgusting water washing across the broken and lowered metal plates and grates for several seconds. "And you're sure you want to accompany me?" Nick asked as he looked at Winter. Winter didn't immediately answer. "You really don't have to," Nick added. "As the chief Zephyx extractor, this is my job, not yours." Winter just kept looking at the disgusting water. He took several deep breaths, then he started to retch and cough, yet Winter kept looking at the dirty water. A moment later, his legs shook a bit, and finally, he sighed. "I'm sorry," he said. "It's fine." Nick said with a nod, "It's not your job." "Nick, I'm really genuinely sorry," Winter added. "I honestly want to go with you, but I just can't. I don't have the courage." "Sorry." "It's fine, dude," Nick said with a bit of annoyance. "You can just stay here until I return. If I am accompanied by something that's attacking me, you can help me with that." "I will," Winter answered with a nod. After Nick had signed the NDA, Winter had also told Nick about his ability. As one of the heirs to the Melfian family, Winter had received something to protect himself. Winter's Zephyx synchronizer was also already attuned to a specter. However, the ability the specter gave people was not something that was very useful for a Zephyx extractor. It was basically only good for running away from someone. Nevertheless, it was still very good at what it did. While Winter couldn't capture any specter on his own, he could still debilitate and weaken it. Naturally, Winter had received that ability for two reasons. First, his parents wanted Winter to have something that could protect him. Second, they didn't want Winter to become a Zephyx extractor, and the best way was for Winter's synchronizer to already be occupied with a relatively useless ability for extractors. "If I see anything attacking you, I will immediately support you," Winter said with conviction. Nick just nodded. "Also, since I'm not accompanying you, I might as well give you these," Winter said as he took out 3 long tubes of glass. Nick looked at them with furrowed brows. "What's that?" "Arclight," Winter answered. "And how will that help me?" Nick asked. "Everyone knows that artificial light sources don't help against the nightmare. This is different," Winter said as he pointed at the 3 long tubes. "Each one is harvested from a level 3 specter. They actually help against the nightmare." This surprised Nick quite a bit. "Be careful with them," Winter added. "Each one costs around 10,000 credits, and they only work for a minute each. If you feel like you can't handle the nightmare's influence anymore, just break one of them. An area of light will appear around you, but it will dissipate after around a minute. The containment unit and building already consumed most of my budget, and I can't afford more of these arclights without jeopardizing our daily operations. Use them when necessary." Nick looked at the 3 glass tubes with newfound appreciation and bound them to his thigh. "Thanks," Nick said. "Good," Winter said with a nod. "I hope everything turns out well for you." "Thanks," Nick repeated. Then, Nick took a deep breath. At the same time, Winter turned around. In order for Nick's powers to activate, Winter also wasn't allowed to see him. For the next couple of seconds, Nick took several deep breaths. Finally, Nick put on some diving goggles that Winter had bought him and jumped forward. Nick could have just walked into the murky pool of water, but he feared that he would turn around if he came into contact with a bit of the liquid, so he decided to directly jump in. Splash. The splash was noticeably more lethargic and subdued compared to the typical splash of water. It was just too viscous. Thanks to his ability, Nick easily jumped forward for over 5 meters without needing a running start. As soon as Nick touched the murky liquid, all his senses fired at the same time. Nick felt several small pieces of cloth touch his skin. He had also hit 2 small but solid objects, which were quickly pushed away by his body. The next moment, Nick felt how incredibly sticky the liquid was. In a way, it felt like the liquid was trying to trap him in place. Some of the liquid went into Nick's ears and nose, and he had to do his best to resist the urge to vomit. Disgusting. All of Nick's body shouted at him that this was disgusting. It was so bad. However, instead of immediately panicking, Nick remained motionless in the liquid first. He knew that he had to get acclimated Nick had already pulled his knees to his chest to make the surface area of his body as small as possible, but his body was still violently shaking. He wanted to throw up so badly, he just wanted to push his head above the surface and scream. Yet, Nick just remained stationary for several seconds. Nick didn't move during these seconds. He felt several small pieces of cloth get caught by his body. Finally, Nick slowly extended his body. As he felt his chest and thighs come into contact with the liquid, his body shuddered again. And then, Nick slowly swam upwards, splash. Nick's head broke the surface, but he didn't immediately open his eyes. He knew that he was wearing diving goggles, but he had still closed his eyes. Over the next seconds, Nick slowly opened his eyes as he looked upward. Brown and green liquid was sparkling as the light of the sun shone through them. Nick saw small pieces of bandages, and he even saw a couple of small pieces of bone on his diving goggles. Piss, shit, bandages, bones, teeth, blood, rotten meat, insects, poisons, splinters, rusty metal, puke, together with water. All of that was creating the pool of liquid Nick was currently in. A moment later, Nick slowly wiped his goggles, mouth, and nose clean, or, at least, as clean as he could. Finally, Nick took a deep breath. Surprisingly, the smell didn't feel as bad as before, but that was the only positive thing. Nick, is everything all right? Winter shouted, still turned away from Nick. Nick took another deep breath. I'm fine, he answered. Good, Winter shouted back. I'm going to search now. Nick shouted, good luck, Winter shouted back. The next moment, Nick took another deep breath, and then he swam forward, towards the endless depths of the sewers. Chapter 16. Nick swam forward in silence. From time to time, he could hear the sound of someone walking on the road above him, but that was about it. All the other sounds were just the liquid sloshing around Nick's body and face. Cirque. Nick's shin suddenly hit something solid, but thanks to his ability, his shin didn't receive any real damage. The next moment, Nick stopped and used his feet to see what was below him. After all, the liquid was so murky that he couldn't even see further than 10 centimeters. Nick's feet found something big and stable beneath him. In fact, Nick could even stand on it, allowing his torso to rise above the murky liquid. Wonder what that is, Nick thought as he continued wading across the stable. Foothold splash. But after some seconds, Nick lost his footing and fell forward. A moment later, Nick shot upward and scrambled back onto the stable foothold. It's in my mouth. Nick immediately started retching uncontrollably, and it only stopped over 2 minutes later. Note to self, don't breathe in while walking forward, Nick thought. Anyway, seems like my foothold ended after about 10 meters. I guess that's the size of a house. A moment later, Nick decided to walk along the edge of the perceived building he was walking on. And within a minute, Nick had mapped out what he was standing on. Sure enough, it's a house, Nick thought. But then, Nick furrowed his brows. However, the form is unusual, and it's made of stone or brick instead of metal. Almost all houses have a slanted roof because of the rainwater. But the roof of this one is perfectly flat. Even more, all the houses above me are made of metal. A house made of something as luxurious as stone would be far too expensive for the people living in the dregs. Even the houses in the actual outer city are mostly made of metal, albeit rust-free. That was when Nick remembered what the parasite had said. The parasite had called the sewers ruins at some point. Ruins? Nick thought. I guess this stone house is part of the ruins then. But why are there buildings down here? Obviously, no one is living down here. Yet, there are still valuable and functional houses. Even more, the sewers wouldn't have swallowed everything if we had just lived in the houses to begin with. Why did someone build a metallic city above this one? I don't know, Nick thought after some seconds. But one thing is clear. Humans have lived here before. Nick looked around a bit. I want to know how big the house is. The next moment, Nick went to the edge of the house, took a deep breath, and dove down. Nick's hands grabbed the rough stone of the house and pulled him downward. Since no one was watching him, Nick easily managed to pull himself downward. After descending for around 10 meters, Nick reached the bottom. But when he felt it, he furrowed his brows in surprise. Metal? The ground is made of metal here as well? The dregs were buildings made of rusty metal sitting on top of grates and plates of rusty metal. Below that, Nick imagined a stone house sitting on top of more metal. Then, is there even more? Nick pulled back and kicked the floor with all his power. Boom. The ground vibrated, but Nick suddenly felt pain in his leg. He knew all too well where that pain came from. He had hit something that was way too hard. This feels just as hard as the metal that Winter's containment unit is made of. I think he called it steel. A house made of stone on top of a floor made of steel. This sounds way better than the rusty metal of the dregs. Nick thought about this for a while. There's not enough information. A moment later, Nick shot towards the surface to get a fresh breath of air before returning underground. Over the next few minutes, Nick mapped out the building. He even found the door and some windows. Sure enough, it's a residential house. Nick thought by now, Nick had acclimated to the disgusting liquid, and as long as it didn't get into his mouth, he could keep his disgust in check. As Nick looked down at the house below him, he suddenly got the urge to investigate further. Maybe there is some treasure inside. Maybe there are some secrets to uncover? But then, Nick felt a bit of crackling from beneath his feet. The house wasn't breaking apart, but it definitely wasn't stable. That was when Nick realized something crucial. That's dumb. There's no way anything valuable would be left. After all, the people who moved here to build the city must have cleared everything out already. The next moment, Nick narrowed his eyes. Then, he remembered when this feeling had actually occurred. While Nick had been deep below the surface, he had already had the urge to investigate the house. In fact, the urge had been the strongest when Nick had found the door. It's already started. The liquid was so incredibly murky that no light reached a depth of even just 2 meters. This meant that Nick had been in pure darkness down there, the nightmare. The nightmare's influence could be subtle or noticeable, whichever was more useful naturally. The nightmare had influenced Nick in a very subtle manner down there, slowly planting ideas into his head of riches and secrets. If Nick had followed these urges, he would have been in quite a lot of danger. The house was not stable, and even more, the nightmare could also warp someone's perception and create illusions. It could have made Nick move in a different direction than he wanted. And without being able to see or hear down there, Nick wouldn't be able to find his way out. In the end, he might become panicked and break through the wall. But then, the house might collapse on top of him. The nightmare has already influenced me. Nick took a deep breath. I have to be careful. The next moment, Nick decided to stop investigating the ruins below him. Without a constant source of light, investigating the ruins was far too dangerous. I can look at them at some other time. For now, I should look for the dreamer. Chapter 17. Nick focused on searching for the dreamer. The investigator doesn't know what the dreamer looks like exactly, but he said that he knows it can fly. Physical and possession specters of the first level are not nearly powerful enough to fly without wings, which means that the specter is most likely a winged creature of some sort. As Nick swam forward, he kept looking upward. Naturally, the dreamer most likely didn't reside inside the actual murky liquid. It's probably living inside some of these structures. Naturally, there had to be some support for all the metallic plates and grates that made up the floor of the outer city. These supports came in the form of long and wide pillars of rusty metal. But they were not the only kinds of support. Nick had already found a couple of other ruins jutting out of the liquid. For example, there was a wide building made of stone that seemed to touch or fuse into the metallic plates above it. There were also several other sizable buildings made of metal and stone jutting out of the pool. While most of the normal pillars ended in a part of the street with a couple of plates, the sizable ruins that supported the city often ended in big areas of plates. There were no grates for over 10 meters around these big structures. Additionally, most floors below the actual buildings in the dregs were also made of plates instead of grates. In a way, since the sun was directly above Nick at all times, the map of the dregs was reflected on the murky liquid in the form of shadows and big areas of darkness. While Nick was swimming through the sewers, he was essentially following the roads of the dregs above him. It had a kind of bizarre sense of order, sadly. This meant that Nick couldn't fully investigate every part of the sewers without having to enter the darkness. Many buildings were often clumped together, and since the people wanted to avoid the rising smell of the sewers as much as possible, they also replaced their floors with plates. This created areas of pure darkness over 100 meters wide. Naturally, there were also ruins and supports in these areas, and Nick couldn't see much from a distance. Nick was in the light, and if he wanted to look into the darkness, his eyes had to acclimate to darkness first. This meant that he had to enter the darkness if he wanted to see in the darkness, but for now, Nick avoided the darkness. He would only enter when it was necessary. Nick remained on the streets as he continued to search for any movement above him. The good thing about the sewers was that they were so incredibly toxic and disgusting that not even insects came here. The only movement Nick saw came from the rats scuttling across the ceiling of the sewers. Surprisingly, not even the rats were swimming in the liquid. Instead, they were scuttling across the metallic grates with their claws. In fact, there were quite a lot of them. In a certain way, these rats were the pedestrians of the sewers since they also followed the roads, while specters were not. Being hunted by the nightmare, most of their minions were, so even the minions of a powerful specter like the parasite had to avoid the dark places. Luckily, none of the rats were looking at Nick, keeping his ability active in the beginning. Some of them had looked at him out of curiosity, but after Nick had thrown them a glare, they turned around. If the parasite annoyed Nick too much, Nick might decide to hunt its rats, so, out of politeness, the parasite tried to ignore Nick as long as it didn't antagonize Nick, Nick wouldn't antagonize it. That was their unspoken agreement. For several hours, Nick continued searching for the dreamer. The sewers were kilometers upon kilometers long, but luckily, not all the flooring was made of grates. The dregs didn't surround the city. After all, no city would want every single visitor to travel through the absolute worst place they had, so while the sewers covered most of the underground of the city, the dregs were only about 2 kilometers wide and 3 kilometers long. Nick was quite certain that the dreamer didn't go outside the sewers below the dregs. First of all, the other parts of the cities had far more Zephyx extractors. And if any of them found a level 1 specter appearing near them, they would hunt it down. Every specter represented an incredible amount of wealth. Additionally, the nicer parts of the town had the sewers completely isolated, making it impossible for the dreamer to surface. This meant that the dreamer had to focus on the dregs. By now, it should be late evening. Nick thought the sun didn't move. But Nick's inner clock was telling him that it was getting late. According to the inspector, the dreamer has received its name due to the method it uses to hunt and feed. Once a night, it leaves its nest and visits a sleeping person. While they are asleep, the dreamer creates terrifying nightmares for them but doesn't allow them to wake up. For several hours, the person is stuck inside a terrifying nightmare. The next day, the person wakes up again, but they feel even more tired than before they went to bed. Naturally, they also need a long time to recover from the mental stress. Since it's already late in the evening, the first people should already be going to bed. In at most a couple of hours, the dreamer should leave its nest to feed. That's when I can find it. Sadly, I also need to reach it and sneak up on it. That won't be easy. But for now, I should wait. Nick went to one of the ruins that were below some grates and grabbed the edge. Then, Nick slightly pulled himself down so that only his nose and eyes poked out. He didn't want the dreamer to see him when it searched for its food, and like this, Nick waited. Chapter 18. Nick waited for several hours in the horrible liquid. During this time, he had a lot of time to think. For example, he had thought about how he had ended up in this place naturally. After being inside such a disgusting place for so long, Nick had questioned his life choices. But in the end, Nick thought that it actually wasn't so bad. After all, he was currently trying to turn his life for the better. The worse it was, the fewer regrets he would have in the future in case he decided to accept the investigator job. At least, he could say that he had even swam through a pool of piss and shit in an effort to become a Zephyx extractor. By now, it was deep in the night, but the sun still shone brightly in the sky. Way fewer people were walking around above the grates, and Nick had also seen a drop in streams of piss and nuggets of shit coming down through the grates into the pool. Yet, Nick still hadn't seen the dreamer. He constantly kept a lookout for its whereabouts. But Nick just couldn't find it anywhere. It should be 12 a.m. already, Nick thought with furrowed brows. Most people should be asleep already, and there should be plenty of victims to choose from for the dreamer. Yet, I haven't seen anything fly around. From this position, I can basically look at everything below the dregs, but I still can't see anything flying around. Naturally, Nick grew worried. Just to be safe, Nick waited for another 2 hours, but still nothing. It should be 2 a.m. now, but I still don't see anything. By now, even Nick's powerful and strengthened skin started to get itchy all over. The liquid was a bit acidic, and Nick had been in it for over 8 hours by now. In the end, Nick surfaced with a helpless sigh. Since it's not flying around, this can basically mean only one thing. Its nest is directly below its victim's home. That means it doesn't need to fly around to feed. Nick looked around and focused on the several big and dark spots in his surroundings. The direct beams of light coming from above Nick created shadowy squares when blocked by the houses of the dregs. In a way, they created shadows of the houses themselves. But instead of being two-dimensional, it was like the shadows took up the entire space below the houses, creating a sort of black domain. However, there were also a few houses with a couple of small grates, representing small spots of light. These grates were mostly left in the houses as toilets. For now, I should focus on the houses with toilets. Nick created a map inside his head of the layout and started from the edge of the dregs. After swimming for a while, Nick stopped in front of the first dark place. In front of Nick was a shadowy area, around 20 meters wide and 50 meters long. There were 2 grates in that area of darkness. Naturally, houses in the dregs didn't get that big. This was simply a small block of houses with 2 toilets. Nick took a deep breath, and then he swam forward. Nick directly swam towards the beam of light in front of him, but he also kept looking around for the dreamer. He saw several pillars and even a ruin jutting out of the pool around him, and he looked at all of them. The dreamer probably wasn't very big, and it could probably even live on the sides of one of the rusty pillars. Nick inspected all the pillars. Suddenly, Nick's body shook and he stopped moving forward in front of him. The pillars seemed to distort and morph into each other. Just a couple of moments later, a terrifying grimace with teeth had been created, and it looked down at Nick with rage. Nick's heart rate rose. That's the nightmare. This is only an illusion. Yet, knowing that it was an illusion didn't help a lot. Nick's terror was still very present and visible. Someone with a phobia of spiders also knew that almost all the spiders weren't even dangerous, yet their fear was still overpowering. Nick was in a similar situation now. He knew that the huge grimace floating above him was not real, but he still genuinely felt like he was about to die. Nick's speed increased. It was almost like his disgust for the liquid had vanished as he desperately tried to get away as quickly as possible. You're going to die. The darkest voice Nick had ever heard had just spoken that sentence, and Nick felt his mind shiver. Yet, Nick just looked forward at the safe beam of light. That was the toilet of the house. You're never going to reach it. The next moment, Nick saw the beam of light slowly going away from him. Nick's breathing quickened, and he didn't even care that some of the liquid entered his mouth at that moment. He needed light. Nick kept swimming and swimming and swimming. Why hadn't he reached it yet? From the start, the toilet was barely 10 meters away from him. That took some seconds, but that was it. Nick was quite sure that he had been swimming for over half a minute by now. Where was the light? Ha 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 ha. The dark voice laughed as the light traveled further and further away from Nick until eventually it was gone. There was no more light, there was only darkness. An endless forest of tall and rusty spires rose from the pool around Nick, but that was it. No matter in which direction Nick looked, he only saw an endless forest of rusty spires. There was no escape. The next moment, the grimace of spires slowly descended, its expression morphed into a malicious smile, and then it slowly moved towards Nick. Nick knew all of this wasn't real, but he also knew that he would die if he stayed in the darkness. The longer the nightmare influenced people, the worse it got. Nick turned around and swam away from the grimace. He had to flee. He was going to die. Ha 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 ha. The grimace laughed as it came closer. No matter what Nick did, it was coming closer. Nick closed his eyes in terror. He would die. I'm sorry, Winter, but I have to use it. Then Nick grabbed one of the tubes of glass and broke it over his knee. Chapter 19. The next moment, Nick was bathed in light. From black, everything transformed into white. Nick's eyes burned due to the sudden influx of light, but they quickly adapted. The next moment, the light became less bright, and Nick could finally look around. How did I end up here? Nick thought with surprise. Right now, Nick was between the 2 toilets when he had not even reached the first one. The nightmare must have created more illusions that made me change my trajectory. Nick took a deep breath. As long as I enter a sizable area of darkness, the nightmare can actually keep me perpetually trapped in it. No wonder no one wanted to search for the dreamer down here. The danger is not the dreamer. The danger is the nightmare. Nick noticed that the light was getting dimmer, and he was preparing to move forward again. I need to find a way to get to the toilet. A bit later, the light was nearly gone, and Nick shot forward again. The pillars were transforming into the forest of rusty spires again. However, Nick just kept swimming forward with all of his power. The next moment, Nick saw something dark slowly rise out of the pool in front of him. It was like a whale had just put its breathing hole a bit above the surface before submerging again. Something was in the water, and it was big. A second later, it rose again, but this time it was angled towards Nick. It was swimming towards him. Nick gritted his teeth, ignoring the liquid that poured through his lips, and then he tightly shut his eyes, but he continued swimming. Everything became silent. It was deathly silent. The only thing moving was Nick. He almost felt like he was in an endless void of nothingness. Ding! Nick's right knee hit something solid, but the object was pushed away. However, Nick knew exactly what he had just hit. It felt a bit soft, but with a hard core. It was a head. A human head. The next moment, Nick hit something again. This time, it was an arm, however. Nick just kept moving forward. More and more body parts appeared in Nick's way, but he just batted them to the side. "I'm sorry," the crying voice of a kid said quietly. The next moment, a small arm grabbed Nick's ankle. "I'm so sorry," the kid shouted. "Please, forgive me." The next moment, several other arms grabbed Nick. They wanted to pull him into the depths. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry." A chorus of different but desperate voices shouted from all around Nick as the grips of the arms tightened. Nick couldn't move anymore. He had been completely immobilized. Nick's terror reached new heights, but he only kept trying to swim forward. That was the only thing that could save him. Splash! Nick was suddenly pulled under. The arms tightened around him and continued pulling. And then, Nick suddenly felt it. Teeth. Huge teeth. Nick's legs hit a couple of teeth, and the teeth were almost a meter long. Even more, Nick's body wasn't nearly strong enough to resist these teeth, and his legs started to bleed in his panic. Nick desperately tried to swim away, but the arms kept pulling him back. Even more, the arms seemed to come out of this thing's mouth. The arms were pulling him into the maw. Nick felt the maw advance. A deep shadow appeared around Nick as he was engulfed. There was another specter in here, and this was not a level 1 specter. He would die. He would die. Nick felt himself get pulled further and further down into the maw, and then everything stopped. Nick didn't move for several seconds. But nothing happened. Slowly, Nick opened his eyes, and he saw light. He was below one of the toilets. "I did it," Nick thought in shock. "I actually did it." For several seconds, Nick just looked at the light above him. He was safe. There was no second specter. Splash! Suddenly, something splashed in the liquid in front of Nick, and all his anxiety returned. Nick looked down, and then, he saw it. A floater. A turd. The person in the house above him had just taken a shit. Nick grimaced in disgust. Really? Now? And with that, all of Nick's elation was gone and replaced by annoyance. Anyway, I can look for the dreamer now. Due to the extreme darkness, Nick couldn't see all parts of the ceiling from any one spot. Because of that, he went to the little safe spots to search the ceiling. The next moment, Nick poked his head into the darkness, but his body remained in the light. The nightmare's influence returned, but it was far weaker than before. By moving his head out of the light like this, Nick could look at the 100 square meters above him with quite a lot of confidence. However, since 100 square meters were only 10 by 10 meters, Nick needed to do this from several locations to check everything. After he looked at the ceiling above him, Nick readied himself to swim towards the next toilet. Obviously, the dreamer wasn't here. Nick took a deep breath and readied himself. "I've done this before now, I just need to do it again." Then, Nick shot forward. The terrors returned. Nick closed his eyes. "Turkey." Nick stopped breathing as he felt some teeth tear apart out of his arm. The pain was brutal and sharp. Nick opened his eyes and looked at his right elbow. His flesh had been torn off. Only the bloody bone of his elbow was left. Is this real? Nick thought. I've never heard that the nightmare could do something like this before. Right? The teeth of the maw also tore my legs open. But when I reached the light, there was nothing. I have to keep swimming. Even though a huge part of Nick's arm had just vanished, he still continued swimming as he closed his eyes. He had to reach the toilet. The next moment, something tore Nick's leg off, and Nick was nearly pulled under by the force. Nick wanted to scream due to the pain, but he just kept swimming forward. He had to reach the light. He had to reach it. More and more of Nick's body was torn apart, and Nick wasn't even sure what he was anymore. His being was so overwhelmed with pain that his mind even blacked out for some seconds. He was dying. He wanted to die, but he wanted to live. It was so bad. It was so horrible. Just move forward, just a bit, please, just a bit. And then everything stopped again. Nick opened his eyes. He had reached the second toilet. Chapter 20. Silence. Nick just looked at the ceiling in silence. He had expected that things wouldn't be as bad the second time. He had been wrong. Things had been even worse the second time. Back when Nick had been underwater, the nightmare had used subtle influences. The next time, it had used horrors to stop Nick from moving to where he wanted. Then, it created illusions of Nick losing control and being swallowed, and now it had just directly inflicted an unending amount of pain on him. The nightmare had lost all its subtlety. It had transformed from horror into terror. Nick just looked at the light at the ceiling. He wasn't sure what he was feeling. Fear, apprehension, relief, anxiety. This wasn't like the last time. Nick had been happy that he had managed to do it, but this time, Nick was not happy. The pain had been bad, real bad. For several minutes, Nick didn't do anything. He just looked at the ceiling with a worried expression. He didn't want to feel such pain again. He never wanted to feel something like that again. Just now, his body had been torn apart one piece at a time. This was a pain that should have killed someone, but he was still alive. Nick gulped in worry. I don't want to do this again. How many times do I have to do this? What will happen next? I can barely swim for a bit more than 10 meters in pure darkness, and it's already this bad. This is one of the smaller blocks of houses. There are blocks with no toilets, which means I have to look at the ceiling while under illusions. And then I need to go back. Also, what about when I actually find the dreamer at the ceiling in one of those? At that point, I need to climb one of the pillars in pure darkness and catch it. The nightmare could easily show me illusions and make me move in the wrong direction. Nick just floated on the liquid as he looked up. Silence. I don't know. I have no idea how to find and catch the dreamer. For over 10 minutes, Nick didn't do anything. Naturally, Nick knew that he couldn't spend the rest of his life in the light of this little toilet. He had to leave at some point, yet he just couldn't. The terror he had felt just now was too much. The pain was too much. He was only 16 years old. He had never undergone something this painful or terrifying. This was not the work of some random weak specter. No, this was the nightmare, one of the only 5 level 9 specters. Even the strongest. Zephix extractors couldn't remain in the darkness for an extended period of time. The nightmare's power was absolute. It had killed tens, if not hundreds, of thousands of people just by mentally breaking them. It had killed people far more experienced and tenacious than Nick. I can't do it. Silence. I just can't do it. I have to do this one more time to get out, but I don't think I can enter another block of houses. Nick felt his chest shiver and hurt, regret, frustration, self-loathing. I'm not strong enough to do this again. I want to turn my life around, not end it. If I go through something like this again, I don't know if I will ever recover. What then? I want to try my best, but if I fail, I fail. It's fine. I can become an inspector. It's not like I have some lofty and idealistic goal that requires me to become the strongest person in the world. No, I just want to live a good life. But what's the point of living a good life when I wake up in a cold sweat because I keep re-experiencing the things I have seen and felt here every night for the remainder of my life? Nick looked to the side at the block of darkness waiting for him, and then some tears appeared in Nick's eyes. I'm sorry. I just can't do it. I'm not strong enough. Silence. The only sounds down here came from the quiet scratching of the rat's claws and Nick's crying. It was just too much for him. Nick had just started his journey as a Zephix extractor, and he had already confronted one of the 5 strongest specters several times. This wasn't something that he could deal with. This was far beyond his current level. He gave up. For the next couple of minutes, Nick looked at the darkness around him. Then he moved his head into the darkness and did a routine scan of the ceiling. Maybe he was lucky and the dreamer was actually here. It wasn't. Nick took a deep breath. He only felt fear right now. He didn't want to enter the darkness again, but he had to. He couldn't remain here for the remainder of his life. Nick took another deep breath. It took a couple minutes for him to gather his courage, but eventually he shot into the darkness again. As soon as Nick entered, nothing happened. However, Nick didn't let down his guard and just kept swimming forward. Silence. Nick just kept rapidly swimming forward in silence. After a bit, Nick opened his eyes. He saw the light of the street of the dregs in front of him. He was almost there. Nick continued swimming, and then he entered the street. Nick was now in the light of the streets of the dregs. Nothing had happened in the darkness. Nick turned around to look at the block of houses behind him with suspicion. Had the nightmare given up? He doubted it, yet Nick was back in the light again. The nightmare had no influence over Nick here. Bang. Suddenly, something hit Nick's head. Splash. 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 Nick quickly shook his head and looked around him. Rats. Don't want to give me bodies, huh? One of the rats spoke. How about you give me your body then? And then the rats all charged at Nick.